San Quentin Prison Secrets Revealed: What really happens inside America's toughest prison. If you're drawn to the darkest truths hidden behind prison walls, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's reality, and it's more disturbing than fiction. The sirens didn't stop that morning. Inside San Quentin State Prison, one of America's oldest and most notorious maximum security facilities, chaos had erupted in a way no one on duty would ever forget. Guards sprinted through narrow concrete corridors, radios crackling with overlapping voices, each one more urgent than the last. Shots fired, multiple inmates down, officer unresponsive. The air smelled like gunpowder and panic. In the adjustment center, San Quentin's most secure unit, where the most dangerous inmates were kept, a violent confrontation had just turned into something far worse. Blood stained the cold floor. Bodies lay motionless. And somewhere in the confusion, a question echoed through every officer's mind. How did it get this far? At the center of it all was a name that had already made headlines across America: George Jackson. Jackson wasn't just another inmate. He was a revolutionary figure, a co-founder of the Black Guerrilla family, and a man whose writings from prison had ignited political debates far beyond San Quentin's walls. To some, he was a symbol of resistance. To others, he was one of the most dangerous men in the California prison system. He had been serving time since 1961 for armed robbery. But it wasn't that sentence that made him infamous, it was what happened after. Inside prison, Jackson's influence grew rapidly. He organized, he educated, and he challenged the authority of the system itself. Guards watched him closely, knowing that his presence alone could shift the balance of power inside the prison. And on August 21, 1971, everything finally snapped. Investigators would later piece together the timeline like a shattered mirror. It started quietly. A routine day. Meals served. Cells locked and unlocked. Nothing unusual, at least on the surface. But beneath that routine, tensions had been building for months. Racial divisions, gang alliances, and political unrest had turned San Quentin into a powder keg waiting for a spark. Jackson, housed in the adjustment center, was under constant surveillance. Yet somehow, against all odds, a gun ended up in his hands. That was the moment everything changed. Witnesses described what followed as fast, brutal, and completely out of control. Jackson allegedly opened fire, and within minutes, the prison descended into chaos. Guards were taken hostage. Inmates joined the uprising. The lines between control and anarchy blurred instantly. Correctional officers scrambled to respond, but the situation was unlike anything they had trained for. 3 guards and 2 inmates would lose their lives that day. And George Jackson? He was shot dead in the prison yard, his body lying just feet from the towering walls that had held him for over a decade. But the deeper investigators dug, the less sense it made. How does a maximum security inmate, one of the most heavily monitored prisoners in the country, obtain a firearm inside one of the most secure prisons in America? That question haunted everyone. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the gun had been smuggled in by an attorney. Others whispered about inside help, guards or staff members who may have been compromised. There were even claims that the entire incident wasn't just an escape attempt, but something far more calculated. Something planned to send a message. The official reports tried to close the case neatly. They labeled it an attempted escape that turned violent. But not everyone believed that version. Surviving inmates spoke in hushed tones about what really happened behind those locked doors, about alliances, betrayals, and a system that may have been more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. And then came the most chilling detail of all. During the investigation, authorities discovered that Jackson hadn't been acting entirely alone, and that the network he helped build inside San Quentin hadn't died with him. It had only gone deeper underground. But when detectives uncovered who might have helped smuggle that weapon inside, what they found changed everything. The name didn't appear in any official report at first. It was buried beneath layers of silence, redacted documents, and carefully worded statements, the kind that are designed not to reveal the truth but to contain it. But investigators kept digging. Because the more they reviewed the events of August 21, 1971, the clearer it became that George Jackson couldn't have pulled it off alone. San Quentin was designed to prevent exactly this kind of breach. Every movement was monitored. Every visit recorded. Every interaction scrutinized. For a firearm to make it inside the adjustment center, the most secure part of the prison, meant one thing. Someone on the outside had helped, or someone on the inside had allowed it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place: the visitor logs. On paper, everything looked routine. Attorneys, scheduled visits, timestamps, signatures. But one name stood out the moment investigators cross-referenced it with Jackson's recent activity: Angela Davis. A well-known political activist and academic, Davis had already been under national scrutiny for her outspoken views on prison reform and systemic injustice. But her connection to this case ran deeper than anyone initially realized. The weapon used during the incident, a 9mm pistol, was traced back to a purchase registered under her name. Suddenly, the case exploded beyond prison walls. News spread rapidly across the United States and into Europe. This was no longer just a prison riot. It had become a political firestorm, raising questions about activism, justice, and whether this was a coordinated effort tied to a larger movement. But even that revelation didn't fully explain how the weapon got inside San Quentin. Because getting a gun registered to Angela Davis into the hands of George Jackson inside the adjustment center required more than just ownership. It required access. And access inside San Quentin was tightly controlled by one group: correctional staff. Investigators began quietly examining guards, supervisors, and anyone who had direct or indirect contact with Jackson. Interviews stretched late into the night. Every detail mattered. Every shift, every unlocked door, every unexplained moment. At first, nothing concrete surfaced. Most officers denied any involvement, and many were genuinely shaken by what had happened. Some had lost colleagues that day. Others were still trying to process how quickly control had been lost. But there were inconsistencies. Small ones. A door reported locked, that may not have been. A movement logged at a certain time, that didn't match eyewitness accounts. A guard who claimed to be in one corridor, but was seen somewhere else entirely. Individually they meant nothing. Together they formed a pattern that investigators couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, outside the prison, tensions were rising just as fast. Supporters of Angela Davis claimed she was being framed, that her connection to the weapon didn't prove intent, and that the system was targeting her because of her political beliefs. Protests erupted in major cities across the United States and even spread internationally. Free Angela Davis became more than a slogan. It became a movement. But inside San Quentin, something else was happening. Something quieter, and far more dangerous. Inmates who had survived the incident began pulling back, speaking less, watching more. The usual tension inside the prison had shifted into something colder, something calculated. Because Jackson's death hadn't ended anything. If anything, it had created a vacuum. And in prisons like San Quentin, vacuums don't stay empty for long. The Black Guerrilla family, the group Jackson had helped build, didn't disappear. It adapted. Leadership changed hands. Messages continued to move through coded conversations, handwritten notes, and trusted intermediaries. Investigators started to realize that whatever had been set in motion before August 21st hadn't stopped that day. It had evolved. Then came the second shock. A correctional officer, one who had been on duty during the incident, came forward privately. At first he refused to put anything in writing. He was nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder, speaking in fragments. But what he eventually revealed sent a chill through the entire investigation. He claimed that weeks before the incident, there had been warnings. Not vague threats or prison rumors, but specific intelligence suggesting that something major was being planned inside the adjustment center. And those warnings had been ignored. Worse still, he suggested that certain individuals in positions of authority may have deliberately chosen not to act. The implication was terrifying. If true, it meant the violence that erupted, the deaths, the chaos, the loss of control, might not have been a complete surprise. It might have been allowed to happen. As investigators pushed deeper, the line between negligence and something far more intentional began to blur. And just when they thought they were getting closer to the truth, the officer who had come forward suddenly withdrew his statement. No explanation. No follow-up. Just silence. But it was what happened the next day that truly shook the case. Because another inmate, one who had been scheduled to testify about what he saw inside the adjustment center, was found dead in his cell under circumstances that didn't quite add up. And with that, it became clear. This wasn't just about what happened on August 21st anymore. Someone was still trying to keep the truth buried. The cell door was still locked when they found him. That was the first detail that didn't make sense. The inmate, one of the few remaining witnesses who had been inside the adjustment center during the chaos, lay motionless on the cold concrete floor. No signs of a struggle. No noise reported during the night. Just silence. Officially, it was labeled a suicide. But inside San Quentin, very few people believed that. Because this wasn't just any inmate. He had been scheduled to testify, not just about what happened during the uprising but about what happened before it. About the whispers, the warnings, and the people who might have known more than they admitted. And now he was dead. Just like that, another voice was gone. Investigators felt the case slipping through their fingers. Every lead seemed to collapse just as it got close to something real. Witnesses changed their stories or stopped talking altogether. Documents went missing or came back heavily redacted. Even the correctional officer who had hinted at ignored warnings refused to speak again. It was as if an invisible line had been drawn, and anyone who crossed it didn't last long. Outside the prison walls, the case continued to explode. Angela Davis was arrested and charged in connection with the weapons used in the incident. The trial that followed became one of the most watched in American history. Supporters argued that owning the firearm didn't prove involvement in a violent plan. Critics insisted it was too big a coincidence to ignore. 4 months, the world watched as the courtroom became a battlefield of narratives. Activism versus accountability, symbolism versus evidence. And then in 1972 the verdict came in. Not guilty. Angela Davis walked free. For many it felt like a resolution. But inside San Quentin nothing felt resolved. Because the central question remained unanswered. How did the gun actually get inside? The deeper truth, the one buried beneath politics, protests, and public trials, never fully surfaced. There was no definitive explanation. No confirmed accomplice. No clear breakdown of how one of the most secure prisons in America had been breached so completely. Only theories. Some believed the weapon had been smuggled in through legal visits, hidden in plain sight where security procedures failed. Others pointed to possible insider involvement, a guard, a staff member, someone who knew the system well enough to exploit its weaknesses. And then there were the darker theories. That the warnings had been real, and deliberately ignored. That tensions inside the prison had been allowed to build, unchecked, until an explosion became inevitable. That what happened on August 21, 1971, wasn't just a failure of security, but a failure of responsibility. George Jackson's death was supposed to close the chapter. Instead it opened a deeper one. Because even after the smoke cleared and the headlines faded, the system inside San Quentin didn't return to normal. It changed. Surveillance increased. Control tightened. But beneath it all, something lingered, a quiet understanding that the prison wasn't as impenetrable as it seemed. And that power inside those walls didn't always belong to the people in uniform. Years later, former inmates would speak about that day in fragments. Never the full story, never the complete truth. Just pieces. Glimpses of something larger. A guard looking the other way. A door opening when it shouldn't have. A warning that never reached the people who needed to hear it. Or maybe, one that did. Because the most unsettling part of the San Quentin incident isn't what's been proven. It's what hasn't. No final report ever fully explained it. No single narrative tied everything together. The official version exists, clean, structured, and controlled. But the reality? It's scattered across testimonies, lost evidence, and the silence of people who either couldn't speak, or chose not to. And maybe that's the real secret of San Quentin. Not just that something went terribly wrong inside one of America's toughest prisons, but that the full truth of what happened that day may still be locked behind those walls. And if it could happen once, under that level of security, under that level of scrutiny, then the question isn't just how it happened. It's whether it could happen again. Because sometimes the most dangerous place isn't where the criminals are kept. It's where the truth is hidden. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.